Igual ho si Genevieve Cabrera, mafanyao do sa ipan, mapoksay do winigita sa ipan. Da hagasa di si dinikikeo, mampus importanti I hafafinapos niya I Tamoro za ni rafaluas sang katan na Marianas, enegi na mampuso no gai animo manususunido para tasiga tumungo mas hafa masusedi gwini siya gislata. Giman malufan, gipresenti, zani hafa para tafa naugwi fa magunta para iman mamayla siya na tempo. So basically, I just said who I am and that history has always been important to me as a young child growing up. It was my first education. Formal education was, as you know, everybody else is in the classroom, but first and foremost for an oral culture, of which the Chamorro and Carolinian cultures are. Education started at home with family genealogy, and with family genealogy comes archipelago genealogy, if you will. And it's important that we keep the past alive. We use it in the present, and it is the tool that we give to our children so they can have a meaningful life and they can further appreciate who they are, their identity as Native Pacific Islanders, whether native or transplanted. But it is key to know who you are, where you come from, because it tells you, gives you an idea, guides you to where you want to and need to be going. My parents, my mother is the former Rosa, Roberto Sablan, married to Lorenzo de Longuerero Cabrera. She's now Rosa Sablan Cabrera, not Genevieve Sablan Cabrera, obviously. They're both native to Saipan. Not unlike all residents of islands worldwide, we are multi-ethnic. I have native Chamorro, Rafalosh, English, and I think there's an infusion there of some Chinese. We're still working on that on my maternal side. And we have native Chamorro, Spanish, Portuguese on my father's side. I grew up in Taranca, which is what native folks, island folks use for Chalankanoa. But that was what was used during the Japanese period. They would always refer to Chalankanoa, not as Chalankanoa, but Taranca. It's like a shortcut. But I was born at Dr. Torres Hospital, which was at that point in time up in the Astrolahi area, which is now where the Northern Marianas College campus is. And village-wise, grew up formative years in Chalankanoa District 3, and then we moved for a couple of years to Chalankanoa District 1, and then moved back to District 3 around, I would say, 79. And we've been there since. But then with the establishment of the Commonwealth of the North Mariana Islands, we had the high number of non-resident workers coming in. We had the construction boom in the 80s, economic boom. And so a lot of the original villages started seeing an influx of non-native residents. And so a lot of the native folks, both Carolinian and Chamorro, started moving into their farmsteads or their agricultural homesteads. And that's what we did. So we now live in what was my mom and dad's agricultural homestead, which is now, if you look at it, it's just a series of residences on both sides of the main thoroughfare. And so the villages are still there. And one of the things I'm finding at present, which needs to be rectified, is the folks that are implementing policy or writing legislation and promulgating regulations, they're not doing their historical homework. Because a lot of people these days, especially those that are not native to the islands, and they swear up and down that they live in Dandan, but you ask them where exactly in Dandan, and then they'll say, well, I live right next door to Jotan Dandan supermarket. And then I tell them, Jotan does not have a supermarket in Dandan. Jotan has a supermarket in Aslito, but Jotan does not have his store in Dandan. That is not Dandan. But you have maps now that are delineated with these errors, and that needs to stop, because then that's how we lose provenance to oral documentation of what was happening here on our islands during the Spanish period, German period, pre-war Japanese period, World War II, and post-World War II. And when you get, it's just like going into an archaeological site and it's compromised. You have something that has been disturbed to the extent that it no longer gives you a genuineness or a non-compromised status to that site. Then your story's already skewed. And that's not what we want. We want to pass on history that is factual and not pass something on that at some point in the future is going to become problematic. I think the reason why the error came about is in the native ways. That area where Jotan's store is, the Shell gas station, those houses, because that road now is Talan Monsignor Guerrero, right? And it turns into Isa Drive as you're moving east and into the back area of the island. In the old days, pre-war or pre-Spanish period German, throughout pre-war Japanese, and post-World War II, our ancestors used that road to go from main village Garapan, which was the main village during the Spanish period, German period, pre-war Japanese period. And so those native families that had farmsteads along the eastern coastline of the island, they used one of two roads. They used Talanlalo, and you wonder why that road is named Talanlalo, and Lalo's way over on the east end of the island. Well, they called it Talanlalo because that's how folks living in Garapan were able to access their farm plots that are situated in Laulau proper or in the periphery of what is today Laulau and into Papagu area, but along the eastern ridgeline and coastline. Now, the road that is now Talan Monsignor Guerrero is actually called Talandandan, because that's how folks down all along the western coastline, the villages there, that's how they accessed family property that's in the Dandan proper area. And Dandan is that promontory, it's that bluff. There is no lower Dandan. And that's another error, because you have homesteads, and people are swearing up and down, well, I live in Lower Dandan. No, there's never been a Lower Dandan. That area, that flat area, which encompasses the boundary of Asperdido into what was Aslito proper, continues to be Aslito up to that bluff, because on that bluff is Dandan proper. So Talandandan, if you were to correctly refer to the Jotan supermarket or the CUC offices or that tire shop or Java Joe's going up, or Shell, well, Shell is correct because it's on the Aslito side. It's on the south side of that road. But for Jotan, because a lot of people are using Dandan, it should really be Talandandan, Aslito, because Talandandan gives them a location or a situation. It abuts Aslito. Anything that's on the northern side of that road, Talandandan, Talan Monsignor Guerrero, is Kanat Tabla. But Kanat Tabla only comes so far to the northwestern periphery before it abuts Astatlahi. And Astatlahi is on both sides of the road because that was private property. That's Tatlahi family property. And the government, local government, just decided to put a road right through. So that is spread throughout the entire island. You've got areas where they're saying, well, another example is, where do you live? I live in Fitna, San Antonio. No, you can't live in two different areas at the same time. Where do you live? Are you in San Antonio or are you in Fitna? Where do you live? Are you closest to the church? Are you closest to where the old mayor's office used to be? Oh, I live right behind the old mayor's office. So right behind, do you mean, are you inland or are you towards the ocean in reference to the old mayor's office? Oh, I'm behind it. I'm close to there's a little hill there. Okay, so you're in Fitna. You're not in San Antonio. And all these village names, San Antonio, San Jose, San Roque, these are all post-World War II references. So you can't say I live in San Antonio and my parents who were born before the war lived in San Antonio. No, that's incorrect. So that's what I mean. People need to know their history. Same thing for the folks that get elected and serve up on that hill. They sit in seats and offices up on that hill. They need to take a history course. They need to know their history before they start putting together resolutions to honor this person or that person or rename this place or that place. If I may give you one other example, Jeffreys Beach. Somebody post-World War II, probably back in the late 60s or 70s, started naming it Jeffreys Beach. It is not Jeffreys Beach. We have no idea who Jeffrey is. But it's Unay Hasngunt. And that's been the name since pre-Spanish period. It's the beach at the Hasngunt area of Talufofo. So Unay Hasngunt. And the maps need to be corrected too, because the maps, the names of our islands in the Northern Mariana Islands, Aguiguan is not Aguiguan. Sariguan is not Sarigan on the map. And Alimagan is not Alamagan. So these need to be corrected. But who's going to correct them? Well, it's got to start from somewhere and someone. And that's how we have things. It's our history. We have to have it right. Because people are coming in and they're plastering everything all over the internet now. And a lot of this is just, it's hearsay and it's not correct. So those of us that live here, we call these islands our home. It is our responsibility to tell the story correctly. I was with the Division of Historic Preservation at the time. Scott Russell, who was the first staff historian after the CNMI HPO office was established in 86, legislation was 85 to 86. And then he retired. And someone gave me a tap on the shoulder and they said, why don't you put in for that position? Because your academic background is in that area. And I was with the CNMI Museum prior to that. And so I put an application in and I was hired. And one of the first things that, one of the numerous projects were on the table that were either partially done or just nearing completion. And so we had to pick up the ball. And the Visitor Center for American Memorial Park was actually, the impetus was to get it up and a grand opening in sync with the 50th anniversary of the landing of the Marines for the World War II battle for Saipan and Tinian. Things were going along with the indicated timeline. And then you know how projects go, something happens here, a little something happens over there. And we started to lose a little bit of momentum. And so it was not until 2005 that we actually opened the doors of the visitor center. We had 3 years invested in this project. Historic Preservation Office, Humanities, National Park Service, Coastal Resource Management to a degree, a number of local government entities and private sector individuals that have always been and were still at that time involved in things cultural, things historical. CNMI Museum, and that's when we really sank our teeth into, especially for myself, all those stories I grew up hearing from my mom, who was only 5 during the battle. My dad was only 2. My grandmother, who had an ailing husband, and she had all girls. Her surviving children were all girls, 4 of them. And those stories just, with this project, those stories were just, they came to life. And not just my mom and dad's stories or my grandparents' stories, but everybody who had a story to tell about what they experienced, those that survived those 25 days of battle. It made the project all the more extraordinary, all the more incredible, all the more precious, and the work all the more important to get it done and get it done right. Before the project, we didn't have any mention of the 933 Native, Chamorro, and Carolinian, and Micronesian. There were some Micronesian here that met their demise here during the battle. No mention, no grave markers, nothing in their honor. It was this project that ended up with a monument to them. All those 933 names are there. We were working with 6 different lists dating all the way back to just shortly after World War II during Camp Susupi. And it was just a smidgen of names. And then we came across a couple other lists that were, like 3 of them, it looked like they were in the process of having been amended. More names were being added. And then we had to look at the World War II reparations documents because more names were there. So we had 6 different lists and other sources to pull together and make sense, reference and cross-reference again. And then we also included the public's input because we had to. Those survivors of individuals that died during those 25 days or shortly thereafter, caused by the battle, their death was caused by the battle. We had to have firsthand verification from family members. And so we had a couple of months where the local papers would carry a form talking about the project, in project's narrative and why it was important for families to come forward with verification about so-and-so and did he or she indeed perish during the 25 days of battle or perish immediately thereafter at Camp Susupi, the hospital, field hospital there, because of injuries or trauma perpetuated from the battle itself. So again, when you're looking at those 25 days where the Marines were here, the United States was here, the Japanese military was here, and each one had their objective. They were opponents in conflict with one another. And one was to defeat the other the same, to defeat the invader, because they didn't want to give these islands up. These islands were too important economically for Japan to lose. And then we have a local native population of less than 20,000 caught in the middle. It was not our fight. It was not our parents' fight, wasn't our great-grandparents' fight, but we got caught in the middle and we had to live with that. And we had to rebuild. They had to again find a way to have a life for themselves and for their family, their young children, and to provide a future for their young children. Nowadays, we're reading on the internet, or family members or friends are texting one another how difficult it is because of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And I keep thinking back, whenever we have an issue, whether it's from Mother Nature, natural disaster, super typhoons, I always go back to World War II and what family members, my grandparents, my mom and dad, other family members, other community members, what they went through, what stories I've had the good fortune of having been shared with me. And I think what we have now is nothing compared to what happened then. They were stripped of everything they had, everything precious, including human life. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Entire families got wiped out. My maternal grandmother's sister, she, her husband, and 3 boys, aged 9 to 2, wiped out. And it's these stories, but we still, even with that, they were able to set it aside somehow emotionally, internally, cerebrally, academically. They put it in a place where they could go to it again, but they put it away for the time being because they had more important work they had to do. They had to make sure they provided for the survivors, not themselves. They were always thinking of the children, the next generation. And that's the one thing I think that we have as islanders, how we are raised. And from day one, we are given the tool of identity. And it's that identity with these multiple chapters and subchapters of who you are, where you come from. That's what gives us that resiliency to always come back up after something catastrophic, whether it's self-made, self-imposed, or from our environment. We always spring back up. I mean, we're like a cartoon. I mean, look at Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. I mean, Wile E. Coyote says, have you seen that episode where it says Wilus Coyotus Genius? And then Rhodus Runnus? and he never dies. Even though he, ends up in 1,000 bits and pieces at the bottom of that canyon. Or an anvil falls on his head. But he's always coming back up, and he's always thinking of newer ways to get that Roadrunner. But our resiliency, and it's not just us here in the Northern Mariana Islands, or Guam, or Micronesia. It's islanders in general. It goes back to identity. My identity as a Native Islander, who my parents are, who their parents were, my grandparents, what our family history is. That's all part of who I am. And that's history. We all have history. It's inherent. But whether or not you develop an affinity for it, that's, I think, that provides or delineates lines of comparison between one person with another. So we all have it. We all have history. What you do with it gives the impression to others, implies to others whether or not it's important to you. But again, that was my formal education. History was my first and foremost subject growing up. And you can't divorce history. For those of us islanders, you can't divorce history from your culture, from your language. Who you are, your culture is who you are. Your language is who you are. Your history is who you are. So all of this is a mix. These are all the ingredients that make up who you are. And if you live your life and you're missing an ingredient or two, I don't think your life would be as enriched or as impassioned as somebody who recognizes what their makeup is. And it's natural when you have that. It's like breathing oxygen, breathing air. And when you're talking to someone, I keep waiting. When I go on, it's kind of hard to stop because I just have so much already that I've learned. I'm 58 years old. I have a lot of information. And I don't believe any one person should hog information. You can't keep it because now we live with the adage, information, knowledge is power. Well, that's a lot of baloney. If you want to be a true citizen of the world, one who is genuine and one who can be a paradigm for the up and coming generations, you can't hoard knowledge. You have to share it. So what I know, and anybody who's willing to listen, what they ask me, I just tell them what I know. And then they have a responsibility to absorb all of that or some of that, or maybe some at the beginning and a little bit more later, depending on what the life situation is. But that is our responsibility as the outgoing generation to the up and coming generation. We have to teach. That's what our parents taught us. That's what their parents taught us. You must leave behind what you were given as gifts by your parents, by the previous generation, what you inherited, what they left for you. We have a responsibility before we leave this planet to hand all of that off in a manner where they can make it work. They know how to make it work. You give them the basic tools, but some folks you need to show them, guide them a little bit further in how to use the knowledge that you're imparting to them. That's when you get them started. You don't just lay everything, you've got an external drive. Okay, here it is. You do what you're supposed to do with it. Some folks can't. Some can't. They can run with that and be very, very productive individuals, very, very viable persons with that. Some need a little bit more nurturing. You need to show them the ropes a little bit and get them going. Your teacher, in the classroom, not everybody learns at the same rate. You've got your advanced students, and then you've got your average students, and then you've got those that need a little bit more attention so they can catch up to the rest of the class. So it's the same. It's the same in life. And that I was taught very young in my home by my parents. And one of the saving graces of our culture is those of us become lucky enough to have a grandparent living in the household because you have that administrative knowledge, that cultural knowledge, that continuum. And I had that. My maternal grandfather died in 1958. I didn't get to see him, but his wife, my mom's mom, she lived with us from when we were born to when I graduated from high school and went off to college. And she died that same year. We left Island, my younger brother and sister and myself, because they were going to finish high school in the States while I started freshman year at university. So we left in June, and she was already 77 years of age. And my mom was telling this to us over the phone. We couldn't come home for her funeral when she died that December. So it was just too expensive. And semester break was too short. So it was heart-wrenching, but we knew that if she passed away, we weren't here for when my other grandmother, my dad's mom, passed away also. We were still in the States. And it's so hard, it's difficult when it's the women. In my life, my dad plays a large part. I mean, a lot of what I know is from my dad. But it's like yin and yang. Your dad or your grandfather provides you a certain database, but then your mom and your grandmothers provide you the other half. And my upbringing is just, it was fabulous because I had that, and I still have that. That is always living. And that's the beautiful element to our culture, because our culture is an oral culture. We need to continue that. And that stems from language, knowing your native tongue, teaching your native tongue. Because no offense meant towards Western civilization, but things with Western civilization is written. So you pick up a book, you read it. When you're done, you put it back in your library, or it's on your desk for a bit, or you pass it on to somebody else. But the difference between that and oral culture is every time we mention somebody, whether they've been dead 3 years or 75 years, or a little baby that was just born yesterday, every time we put that person within the context of our conversation, that brings that person to life, living or dead. Any time of the day, we have a conversation, and it's about this or that person or this person. That person, whether that person died a long time ago, that person again springs back to life. A book doesn't do that. A book only does that when you're reading that book. But when you're talking, when you're talking within the span of this hour that we have, and we're talking about family, and we can talk about, maybe mention 100 different names. And every single person that we mention comes back to life. That's the key. That's the treasure. That's the pearl of oral culture. And whether English is your primary language, or Chamorro, or Tagalog, or Japanese, or Korean, whatever it may be, when you tell a story in your native language, something does get lost in translation. Because when you tell a story or you have a conversation in Chamorro or Tagalog, and you ask somebody to translate to somebody else or interpret, unless you are interpreting with your heart and your spirit, if you're just interpreting academically, a lot can be lost. But you have to know how to interpret with this, because then that's when things are given substance. I'm just an instrument, because when I talk about the ancient Chamorros or an historical period, again, I go back to my upbringing, but there is something to be said for our belief system also. Our ancestors have never left. They're still here. And I will give you one example that has manifested that, has personified that. And this, I don't embellish. I don't exaggerate. I tell things as they are, as I've heard them, as I've seen them. And so this little vignette, I was still with the Historic Preservation Office, and I left the office in December of 2006. Long story short, the government wasn't moving with renewal of my contract, and you can see the what's written on the wall. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. And so I had a feeling 6 months in advance, nothing was being done. And then I followed it up again and followed it up. It was already down to about a month, and still nothing changed from what I was inquiring after 6 months prior. And I thought, they don't want me here. So I resigned. But before I resigned from the Historic Preservation Office, and we were surveying one of the sites up at Marpy Point. And it's a coastal site, and I'm not going to indicate where it is because I've seen some increasing degrees of vandalism. So it's just better left where it is. But on the coastal stretch, I was down by the water, and I was doing some soul searching, and I was asking the ancestors, you've shown me so much during these last 4 years with the Historic Preservation Office, so much more than you've shown me in decades before as a youngster growing up. Where do you want me to go? What is the path you want me to continue to follow? Or is it a different path that you want me to follow? Give me a sign. I hardly ask for signs. But at that point, I guess I was just so dismayed and disappointed with how government works. And there are a lot of things that the Historic Preservation Office can bring to fruition, as it did decades before, when it was established as an office. And so when I asked, and I wasn't asking outright as I'm speaking with you now, but talking with them from here. And I asked them to give me a sign. And as I was walking that stretch of beach, there were just a couple of juvenile black-tipped coral reef sharks were coming up. That was a joy to see. Different types of reef fish were also, where the reef, the edge of the reef wasn't far from the beach. So all this marine life was just there. It was fantastic. It was just marvelous. And when I'm walking, I have a tendency to, my view line is to the ground. And so I'm walking, and it's just a lot of rocks and pebbles and sand and seagrass, exoskeleton from a lobster or two, other marine life, hermit crabs. And then after, I stood in one particular spot, and that's when I looked out to the ocean and asked, continued to speak with them and asked them to give me a sign. When I looked back down, between my feet was a spondylus bead. Nothing was there. It was just sand and rock and other marine plant life. There was no artifact, nothing in that area where I was walking back and forth. And then to have asked and to look down and to see a spondylus bead this big, that was a sign. And I knew in my heart and soul that the work they wanted me to do was to continue what I was doing. I was not done. They were not done with me. And that's just one manifestation of what we've always believed. And I was taught growing up that our ancestors are still here. Another example I can provide you is every single time I go back to a Calavera cave to take a look at the site and then see what degree vandalism has gone, which unfortunately continues to increase. But every single time that I've gone to the cave and the surrounding areas, the ancestors have always shown me something new. The pictographs and petroglyphs, that study I was doing, I would go and I'd do a survey. They would show me a number of images. Next time I'm back there, they would show me a new one. And it's not just in Calavera. Every other area of Saipan I visited for my pictograph, petroglyph, rock art, fieldwork, they have shown me something. They can still continue to show me, even though with my present job, I'm not out there as much as I'd like to, but they still provide guidance. And I think that's going to increase once I'm done with what I'm doing right now. So be open, because they are there to teach you. And I've always never understood why, especially on Guam, this proliferation of our ancestors as evil spirits. Don't go in the jungle because they're going to make you sick. Well, you coming down with an ailment is probably because you disrespected their area, the area where you were. Because you also, upon entry of any part of the island that is still untouched, uncompromised, undamaged, destroyed to an extent by modern man, they are still there. Even within the villages, within your own home, they are there. But in areas that are relatively pristine to pristine, you must show respect, because they are still the masters and mistresses of the environment and the ocean, especially the ocean. My maternal and paternal grandmothers, they are the glue. They were the glue. They are the glue. The stories of their lives as young children growing up in Saipan, when they got married. Behind me is my dad's mom and dad. Oh, I turned this way. Okay. That's my grandfather, Prudencio, in the hat. That's my grandmother, Maria. They got married this is February 1926. At the end of World War II, almost nobody had photographs. Some, they had a photograph or two. Photographs were rare in the first place. And then families that did grab a photograph with their precious belongings to take with them as they were running to the caves to take shelter during the 25 days of battle. A lot of those individuals lost that because when the Marines came in and they were cleaning out the caves, going after stragglers, Japanese stragglers, some families perished because the Marines didn't know any better, and their thinking was there would be Japanese military in the caves. It was not until a little bit more later where they found out that civilians were also in these caves alongside Japanese military. And so the flamethrowers, that was their primary weapon at annihilating whatever enemy threat was inside the caves, and sometimes civilians, Japanese, Korean, Native. My mom's mother, when I was little, she would tell us stories about how she would never forget the sound that emanated from a flamethrower when a Marine would pull that trigger to let the flames loose. It was a sound she never heard before, and it was a sound that she would never forget. And that's when you, academically, when you're reading texts about how the battles were won by the United States, especially out here in the Pacific Theater, it wasn't only the LVTs that won the war for the United States. It was also the flamethrower in island warfare. That's what gave them the edge over the Japanese. But one of the things that the Japanese did during the pre-war days was they would take photographs of Native cultural events, baptisms, weddings, funerals, fiestas. And as we know, during the Spanish period, everything revolved around the church. So novenas, rosaries, patron saints. Saipan's patron saint is San Isidro, and so which is the month of May. So the novena is ongoing right now, and so the celebration of the patron saint of Saipan, because the native Chamorro, mostly Chamorro, the Carolinians were still out and harvesting a lot of the marine ecosystem for their sustenance. But the native Chamorros were already inculcated into being farmers, working the land. So San Isidore, or Isidoro, is the patron saint of farmers, hence the novena. And they would take these cultural photographs and make them into postcards. So this photo actually came to light in the family because somebody gave it to my aunt, my dad's younger sister, because they saw the postcard and they said, do you have any idea who this family is? Because it was taken on Saipan. And then she did a little bit of research, so on and so on. And then that's when we learned later on that it was my grandmother and grandfather. And so my grandfather, and then to his right, this is all his side of the family. That's my grandfather's father, the one sitting down in the foreground with the mustache. He died over at Hopwood. Hopwood is Cabrera family property. He and a number of family members met their death there when the Marines landed. He went out to look for water because a number of the females in the family were pregnant. And so water was hard to come by. And so he went out one morning, and there was an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening where the shelling would stop. And it was during this time of the day, morning and evening, that men of the family would go out to look for water, to look for foodstuffs, to bring back, primarily for the children and those with child. He never made it back that morning that he left. And he had dug a family, it was in a cave, but they dug a pit not far from the beach line, because that area was the coconut grove, and he inherited the large tract of coconut grove. There were 13 in his family. That family was so large, they had a Maria the elder and a Maria the younger. He was the 6th male child, but I think he was number 8 down from the oldest. And so my great-great-grandfather, his father, Antonio Garrido Cabrera, was only one of 5 families that were given Spanish crown deeds to property on Saipan. These families are still here today. And the family crown deed parcels, you can find descendants of these families still living here. It was the Borja, the Cabrera, the Camacho, the Cruz, and the De Leon Guerrero. The Borjas are still in the Asteo area. That was their area, the eastern shoreline, ridgeline, and down to the shoreline. The Camachos, the late Bishop Camacho, they're still in the Fanaganam area, which is upper area, Navy Hill, up to Mount Taputzo. The Cruzes are to the north, towards Tanapac, San Roque, what is today San Roque. The De Leon Guerreros was all of Fatiguan, which is Chalancanoa. And the De Leon Guerreros brought a suit in court in the 1950s, seeking to reclaim their Spanish Crown properties. But at that point in time, the United States Navy was already implementing and handing out homesteads. So that further, it just exacerbated the land issue to an extent where it was, I guess some may argue, too far gone. Because pre-Spanish period, we had native clan systems. And so clans would utilize terra firma and the marine ecosystem. Only the Matua were allowed out on the water, the upper class. And then the middle class, the Mangatan, only if the Matua allowed them to take part in building canoes and in accessing certain fishing areas of the reef. Only upon permission from the Matua would they do that, engage in that kind of activity. The Ataut, no. These individuals were relegated to the interior, working the land at the behest of the Matua, and to a certain extent, the Mangatan. So, Spanish Crown Deed, all of what is now Cagman, and just another correction, Cagman is something that the U.S. Marines proliferated because they could not pronounce Laderan Akman. Tata is the general native term. Tata, all of the peninsula is Tata. Even the Japanese used that to refer to that area as Tata. So if you hear somebody say Cagman and that needs to change, it's Akman, Laderan Akman. Akman in Chamorro is eel, marine, the ocean eel, not the freshwater eel. Freshwater eel is Asuli, but Akman, Laderan Akman, is Tata or Tata, because the Laderan Akman actually starts at the promontory and then down to the shoreline. So that's Cabrera property all the way up to Canatadung Papago. That's why you still have Cabreras back there. Certain branches of the 13 branches of the main. And then also in Talampio, he had property there. He had property in Gualuray. So you still find Cabreras in these areas. And then the Borjas, Asteu proper, and then surrounding areas, they're still there. The Camachos are still up in the upper Navy Hill, Fanaganam area, and up towards Monteputo. During the Japanese period, they had the 88 Buddha Trail. They had 88 areas where 88 Buddhas were set up on a pathway that led all the way up to Mount Taputzo. These were sites for prayer. They would go from one to the next, but they had 88 stops for prayer. And a lot of this is already under dense jungle. When I was with the HPO, we were able to not recover, but delineate a portion of the pathway. Some people have some of the Buddhas in their private collection, and they've accessed these. They got these shortly after World War II. And so it's better protected in their hands than it is to hand it over to CNMI government, because we know things get lost. And that's unfortunately what happened to the 2 lions that were at the bottom of the stairway for the Hachiman Jinja, which is in Tata. It was the most intact Shinto shrine post-World War II. And they had 2 lions. Both disappeared. The ones that are original to the Hachiman Jinja shrine, they're in private hands. They're not going to disclose that that's what they have. But just a beautiful, beautiful shrine. But it now is, half of it is in public land, occupies public land. More than half of it, less than half is on public land. More than half of it is on private property now, a homestead. And I'm not sure, the gentleman he was having it kept to the extent that Japanese that lived here, especially in the Tata area, they had sugarcane farms or tapioca farms down there. They would come and visit post-World War II. In the 60s and 70s, when tourism from Japan and Okinawa was really at its highest, they would come every year, and they would always make a point to go to the Hachiman Jinja in Tata.